Okay.
Hello, Professor Bansal. I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues, Divin and Shubha Prasad. So the three of us, we have our videos on. We sort of run this thing together. And I'll just sort of briefly introduce you and then we can do the talk and then move on to the questions. So hello, everybody. We have Professor Martin Bansal with us today, a professor of philosophy emeritus, Rutgers University. And he has written extensively on many things: philosophy of history, philosophy of science, and more recently on climate change, and also on causality and counterfactual. So the essay that that we've read, and he's going to talk to us for a bit, and then we'll move on to a question and answer session. Thanks.
Okay, I had to switch this so I can hear you. Can you hear me okay through this mic?
That's fine.
Okay,
fine. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Thank you all for inviting me. I wrote this paper about 25 years ago, and I don't know about you, but I'm like a movie actor who never wants to see the film he was in. I read it yesterday with my heart in my mouth, and it wasn't as bad as I thought. And so it's to revisit this stuff. I thought I would give you a little background on how I came to write it and my interest in this area. Then I would summarize what I think is the main takeaway in case anyone is coming to this who has not studied it. And then I thought I would tell you my reactions to how I would do it differently if I was writing it today. And then we can move to your discussion. And this should take no. I have lived with a historian for 55 years, and so our dinner conversation tends to be at the interaction of philosophy and history, and counterfactuals, particularly since she studies German history and the history of Nazism is the center. There are a lot of counterfactuals that come up at the dinner table of what if this had happened and that had happened. And so it's a very rich discussion. I actually got interested in this when I went to a conference at Princeton University in about 2002 on counterfactuals. And I was the only philosopher in a group of historians, which is sort of, I don't know, Fox and the Chickens or something. I mean, they were easy prey for my pedantic philosophical attitude compared to their relaxed historical attitude. And I came away thinking this is something rich and worth writing about. I had always been interested in counterfactuals because I got interested as a graduate student in causation. And I was partial to the analysis of what it is for one thing to cause another thing, that it has to sustain a counterfactual. That if A is the cause of B, that if A hadn't happened, then B would not have happened. And that was a view of causation that I helped develop against some philosophical counterexamples. And then when I started teaching the philosophy of history, I had my students reading Collingwood. And if you've read Collingwood on history, Collingwood defends the idea that you can't have a simple temporal narrative. Any narrative that is a genuine historical narrative has to, in the end, be causal, and if it's causal, in my view, it has to involve counterfactuals. Now, Collingwood's view of history is pretty mainstream and pretty narrow. I mean, he was writing before, the time of Raudel and the time of other French historians who gave wonderful histories that were not at all narrativist and not at all causal in nature, and some of the wonderful cross-social history of Natalie Davis on custom in Europe, and something that I think has been enlightening in Indian history, which is subaltern history and the history of translating narratives from colonial narratives into. But I still think that Collingwood has a fundamental correct view that a simple narrative of one thing happened after another that's not selective is not going to be very enlightening. In thinking about counterfactuals in history, I was really guided by three principles. The first principle was a commitment against positivism. I went to graduate school in the 1970s. In the 1970s, at graduate schools in the United States, there were still refugees from Europe, Jews who fled under Nazism, who had helped develop a positive view of philosophy of science, really drawing on 19th century physicists who were positivists. And the general doctrine was you need empirical evidence to make any claim, and that if you wanted a serious science or a serious social science or a serious history, it had to be, and that empirically based arguments have to be based on observation, and a counterfactual by definition could not be observational because it's not about something that happened, and therefore counterfactual claims could not be serious. And by extension, if you believed causation was tied to counterfactual, then causal claims couldn't be serious either. And that's why these positivist philosophers idea of all-like claims, not singular causal claims. So I really was at graduate school at the time and a young assistant professor when there was a transition largely driven by Noam Chomsky's attack on behaviorism in psychology, defending the idea that there were generalizations that were not available to observation that guided things like linguistic development and constraints on what was possible, that the notion of laws in science was strong enough that it not only gave you an account of what is the case, but what could be the case, because it put constraints on the possible. And when I wrote about counterfactuals in history, I really expanded on this notion and applied it to history by arguing that if you wanted a defensible account of counterfactuals, it's not just speculative, you had to ground your counterfactual claim in some constraint that couldn't be an observable constraint because counterfactuals are not observable. So it had to be something else. And the idea I began with was the idea of causation. If you had independent evidence that something caused something else, then that could ground a counterfactual based on that causal connection. And in this paper, I looked at other sources of constraint factuals. The most obvious cases are laws of physics, and by extension, other laws, to the extent that you think there are other laws in other sciences, like chemistry or biology or economics. And I tried to show by example how that works. I also showed in this paper, I think that there are certain sets of constraints that are based on simple logic. If you have a two-valued logic and something is either true or false, then if it's false, it's not true. And you can use that as a source of constraints. And then I broadened it in this paper to look at areas of rationality. If you assume actors are rational and you're trying to write a history of decision-making, particularly in history of war, if you assume the people fighting the war are rational agents, which is a dubious assumption perhaps, but in a lot of cases it's in fact not, then you can apply game theory principles to try and show if the general in this case had made this choice rather than this choice, then assuming he or she is rational, certain consequences would follow. And from that, I was able to expand it to more general social game theory constraints. I also think that there are sources of constraints for counterfactual that arise from political organization. To the extent that you have a constitutional system that puts on constraints of, for example, of political succession, then you can derive certain kinds of counterfactual claims that are grounded on that. I also think to the extent that you think there are strict regularities in psychology, you can base counterfactual claims on that. And most important, at the end of the paper, which I didn't really develop enough, I think, I talked about the notion of custom and the way in which custom generates constraints on people. I don't know about India, but I think in America, we live with a kind of myth that we are free agents and very much the masters or mistresses of our own destiny, and we ignore the degree to which social custom constrains the way in which we see the world and the way we behave in the world. And conformity to social custom has a great deal to do with how we see the world. Even more important, and I think more ignored in the way in which the heartbeat of our lives proceeds, is the role of and thinking is actually a function of habit. and the way in which we underplay the role of habit in the way in which we explain the way things work. So that's very much what I tried to do in the paper. In rereading the paper, I think there were sort of three things that I saw that I either ignored and shouldn't have, or three things that I would develop further. And the first thing, which often comes up when I talk history and counterfactual, is what it has a gendered term, great man history. I guess we would call it great person history. The difference that one person can make or has made in history. In the way I wrote this paper, I argued that a counterfactual is only academically respectable if you can ground it in some kind of constraint. And what I argued in discussing the paper is that the problem with what I call one-off counterfactuals, that is one event involving one person, is that as you move forward in time, the possibilities begin to proliferate. And so it's very hard to say why this would have happened rather than that, because possibility intrudes very quickly, and there are no kinds of constraints of the kind I've been talking about. Yet, when pressed, I think it's certainly true. Important people, be they democratically elected or autocrats, make a difference to the direction of history. And so counterfactuals ought to be possible to say about them. And if so, how could you ground them? Well, one of the ways I think it happens is in very trivial ways. You can, in fact, give a counterfactual about an important person, and I think it's robust, trivial. So Indira Gandhi was assassinated on the 31st of October, 1994. Now, suppose some student says, well, if Indira Gandhi had not been assassinated that day, she would have gone to bed that night. And you could say, well, yeah, that's a pretty plausible counterfactual, but it's also a trivial counterfactual. And there's an infinitude of trivial counterfactuals you can pull out in that sense that don't merit serious, so obvious. But there are others that I think are maybe not as trivial, but they're plausible counterfactual. For example, under the American constitutional system, which with Trump in power, we're holding our breath to see how long it'll last as a constitutional system. But at least for now, consider the counterfactual. If Trump had not been elected, or Vance would not have been the vice president. Well, yeah, that's true. It's true as a function of the American constitutional system. Or if Trump died in 2026, Vance would be president in if Trump had died in January, then Vance would have been the president. That follows as a function of constitutional law in the United States. It's not very interesting, but it's trivial. There are other counterfactuals about important people that I think follow from their personality. And again, they tend to be trivial, but I'm not saying you couldn't come up with non-trivial ones. If Trump had not been president, pardons would not have been issued for the thousands of people that stormed the Capitol in 2024. That seems a robust counterfactual because it's a function of Trump's particular obsessions rather than any Republican. And there are counterfactuals of politics. In the year 2000, the Supreme Court of the United States decided that Bush was the winner of the Florida election, and therefore Bush, rather than Gore, would have been was the president. If that counterfactual, now here's a substantial one. If that counterfactual was true, if Gore had won the presidency, there wouldn't have been of Afghanistan. Well, as soon as you do something serious, you have to wonder, how robust is that? It's true that in US politics, the Republicans were more obsessed about Pax Americana than the Democrats were. But I think that's a serious counterfactual, but I don't know how robust it can be. So that's the first thing I would have thought about more if I was rewriting it. I would have put a section in about great person history. The The other thing is at the end of the paper, and just about the last half page, I talk about a notion of the use of counterfactuals in history that I wish I'd developed more, which is not what happened, but how stable what happened is. I'm interested in history between certain historical occurrences that exist on a knife edge. If things had been slightly different, you would have gone in a very different direction, as opposed to events that are very stable. So even if there had been a difference, you still would have tended back to the same point that you proceeded on. In physics, you call this stability under perturbation. If a system is knocked off equilibrium, can it work back to equilibrium, or will it go off in another direction? We face that question in climate change today. Are we going to reach a tipping point in climate change where equilibrium will no longer be possible and it will head off in a particular direction? Useful in examining this notion of stability versus instability by looking at the likely alternatives if what happened had not happened. The other thing that I touch on there, which is an element of this, which I think is radically understudied by historians, is the role of luck and the way in which luck makes an enormous difference, because we have a prejudice in favor of determinism in history, and underplay the importance of just plain luck in making a difference in the way things go. Finally, the third thing that I wish I'd written more about is what I would call probabilistic counterfactuals. The way I wrote this paper, it's very much as a counterfactual. Can you say a counterfactual is true or not? But I ought to have written a section about probability and said there are certain counterfactuals in which we can have great plausible. So we don't have to decide if they are true or false, but we have to decide on their plausibility. And the plausibility of counterfactuals is a function of the degree of evidence there are from constraints. Finally, let me go back to the paper and say something, rereading it, that I don't think is a fudge, but it makes me a little queasy. You remember in the paper I said the notion of constraint is relative. In physics, the constraints can and are very strict, because in physics you have strict laws, deterministic laws in most areas of physics, and they are non-probabilistic laws that constrain possibility. If you go all the way down to history and cultural history, you have nothing like that. You have much weaker constraints, the constraints of custom, the constraints of social conformity. And what I notion of adequate evidence for a constraint in a discipline is a function of the standard of that discipline, and different disciplines have different standards. Okay, so that's my set of introductory comments. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Now I can't hear you. Wait.
Hello?
Yeah, now I can hear you a bit better.
Your audio is catching a little bit also. I think you should.
All right, let me try to.
Just a little bit. It's got nothing to do with the device. It's your connection.
No, now it's better, actually. Okay, go.
Okay. Right. So we can just, whoever has questions, just raise your hand. I can start. I read your article, an earlier article that you'd written on the logic of thought experiments and thought experiments in sciences, and as opposed to the value of thought experiments in philosophy, as opposed to.
I'm sorry, I'm just speak a little more clearly. Say it again.
Right. This earlier article that you had written on the logic of thought experiments, is that better?
The logic of thought experiments, yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether that sort of led to the pieces on counterfactual thinking. Like, was there a connection between, because that was a much earlier essay, is what I saw. And
I think, I haven't read that in so many years. I'm a little embarrassed. The distinction I was trying to make in that is between what philosophers call the context of discovery and the context of justification. And there was a lot of literature at the time, people arguing that thought experiments were a way of establishing scientific truths or general truths. And I was against that view, and I was more for the view that A thought experiment is really a means of discovering, of being creative rather than establishing something. And it was the starting point for thinking about something which you would then have to provide evidence for to support the conclusions. So in that sense, there is a connection in the sense that I was thinking there too about the notion of constraint as a way of explaining something. A thought does not have to be an empirical experiment, but if you want to provide it as evidence, ground it, and you can't ground it in the thought experiment itself, you ground it on the basis of some kind of set of constraints. Now, when Einstein does his thought experiments, he establishes those constraints on the grounds of combinations of logic and laws. But and he shows that if you do a thought experiment in a certain way, you end up with a contradictory situation. So it is, again, a means of discovery, but it's not a means of establishing a proof. So that's the connection. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And another general question that I had, reading this essay on counterfactual and causal analysis, and all the other stuff that we have been reading on counterfactual thinking, do you think that there is any kind of cognitive or epistemic value that imagination has in this schema? Because you say that a robust counterfactual is one that kind of eschews imagination, speculation, and all of those things. So is there a scenario where it can have cognitive value?
I'm pretty mainstream about this. I think that imagination is unconstrained. That's the virtue of imagination. Let me back up. I'm writing a book right now on risk analysis, and it's a non-standard view of risk analysis, and I'm especially interested in when you embark on a course of action which could result in human extinction, not only killing everyone alive now, but everyone who will be. And example that someone had raised, and try to solve the counterexample. And I find when I'm doing philosophy and I'm trying to figure out a problem, I have to sort of put my mind in a kind of neutral state, almost a hypnotic state in which things can pop up that I didn't plan. And I can or driving. Those are the two things I can do. And when you just wake up and you're in a sort of half awake, half asleep. In fact, when I was younger, I used to go to bed twice a night to get double the opportunity for counterexamples. So I think imagination is very mysterious psychological, from a psychological point of view, and I think it's a source of great creativity. But I answer your question, I don't think it's an evidential source for counterfactuals. I think it is a source for prompting counterfactuals, but I don't think it's a source of evidence, because I don't think the mind, thankfully, obeys the laws of science to constrain us. But my mind allows us to be in two places at the same time, or travel faster than the speed of time travel. So no, I'm dubious about it as an evidential source. I only embrace it as a source of prompting hypotheses. You think differently.
No, I was.
I don't know. Your question suggested you thought maybe.
I was reading something. There's this Cambridge Handbook of Imagination, which had a lot of essays, and one particularly on counterfactual thinking by Ruth Byrne. So that was something that I was reading parallelly, where she talks about, the role of imagination in moral cognitive process, the role of imagination and counterfactual thinking in moral cognitive processes and stuff like that. And then throughout that book, there were a lot of there was one on the Vedic traditions of imagination, which normally I'm not. It wasn't very post-colonial in its emphasis, but it was interesting because it said the point that it was making is that there is a certain way of thinking about imagination in the Western tradition that takes away its or that undermines slightly sometimes its cognitive value. And then also I was parallelly sort of teaching a lot of German neoclassical romantic theory. So all of this was in my mind when I asked that question.
But you're a professor of English, right?
I am, yes.
So
but we have to teach a lot.
You come at this with a different set of interests, and I have not thought about. I mean, I can think of a lot of creative uses of counterfactual in the context of, for example, novelistic writing, which could be very creative. And I have to say at the outset, my interest in historical counterfactuals, which was very much based on a rather narrow-minded view of history itself. Called Real History, that's really an attack on extreme relativism, the linguistic turn in history, all of this other stuff. And there's this German expression, wie es eigentlich gewesen war, how it actually was. And I was very obsessed. I have always been very obsessed with the notion of writing history from the inside of the perspective of people, constrained by the knowledge they have available to them. So, my wife studies Holocaust history, and people write about it assuming backwards knowledge that people know the outcome in the decisions they make. So I can see a lot of use of counterfactuals creatively, particularly in literature. And the last thing I want to say is those are in any sense illegitimate. I mean, just to spin that out for a minute, I suppose if I was writing the kind of avenues open to one of my characters, I might want to constrain them as I run through counterfactual experiments for my characters. And that may improve the novel that I'm writing by making their characters more interesting or more plausible or more imaginative. So I might want realistic the account plausible, but I think that's a different enterprise. Thank you.
Right. No, this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll sort of, other people can ask questions. Just because this is relevant to what we are talking about right now, is that another article that I was reading parallelly was by a logician it's a recent article, Michael Kielsker. The article is called The Theory of First Order Counterfactual Reasoning. And he is talking about fluent calculus, which is something that I just learned about today.
He's talking about what?
Fluent calculus, which is a variant of situational calculus, which is a kind of formal logical apparatus to talk about counterfactuals. And all the stuff that we were talking about, like, when you were saying that there are certain consequences that cannot be predicted, the chanciness of luck and stuff like that, all of that comes under this one category that he calls the problem of ramification with a capital R. And then he reduces the whole thing. I don't know if I can share my screen. Like, it's a mathematical formula, but like, if Kennedy had not been shot, if President Kennedy wasn't, or if the assassin had forgotten to load his gun, I'll show you the formula, because I think if I can, because I can't copy paste it. So this is kind of, can you see that? Yeah, so that's the kind of formula that he has used. Like, it's almost and I am, the last time I did calculus was 20 years ago, but I don't think, I was wondering whether you think that there is a way to reduce this problem.
Well, this doesn't look like calculus. This looks like a if-then statements with a lot of disjunctions and conjunctions.
Yeah, it is that, but he calls it fluent calculus.
I'd have to look at the article. My general view is that if you keep a counterfactual, think about an event that moves forward in time. So the world moves forward. There's a world line, and different events intrude. the world line branches. So it's a branching system in which new events. If you consider a counterfactual in which the consequent is very close to the origin in time and space, then you can constrain the ramification. The further out you go, the greater the ramification that will occur and the harder problem you have in pinning it down. If you make the constraints extremely close, if Indira Gandhi hadn't been assassinated, she would have gone to bed. Well, the alternatives, yes, she could have had a heart attack, someone else could have assassinated her, she could have been in a car crash. You can almost delimit the alternatives and put it in a disjunction. So if she hadn't been killed in a car crash and she hadn't had a heart attack and no one else has assassinated her, then she would have gone to bed. Big deal. It doesn't tell you much, anything that you didn't know. But if you ask, how would have Indian history been different? Would your current Hindu power if she hadn't been assassinated? That's an interesting counterfactual, right? Well, there are too many intervening variables. Or take U.S. history. It's said that Hillary Clinton lost the election of 2016 because her trusted assistant, Human Abada, had emails by Hillary Clinton that her sex-crazed husband had on his computer that the FBI was.
I think we might have lost him.
Yeah, I mean, then Trump would have won. So that would have been, as soon as you ramify out, there are just too many possibilities. That's the problem. But send me an email with I'd like to look at the paper and see if
I'll do that.
the person handles it. Yeah.
Professor Bansal,
Yes.
there might be something, there might be an issue with your internet connection because your video stream and your audio stream are catching. And like for example, this time it was a pretty long one, it's like 15 seconds.
Oh no. Let me try moving somewhere else and see if that makes a difference.
If you could go closer to maybe Wi-Fi point.
Hold on. It's weird because I have a fiber optic internet connection to be problematic.
Oh, okay. It's waiting. Sorry.
It's okay. Is this any better?
We'll find out in like
Yeah.
say a minute if it
Oh,
catches again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we have a
this question-
problem. Now we have a problem that I have a 10-year-old grandson who lives with me, and he's going to wake up and he's going to be annoyed and want to get on his Sony PlayStation right next to me. So things may fuck up from that, but we'll see.
There's a question in the chat box. How do you think counterfactuals differ when used by philosophers versus historians or scientists?
I'm sorry, you've got to say it a little more clearly. Say it again.
How do you think counterfactuals differ when they are used by philosophers as opposed to historians or scientists?
Well, I don't think philosophers use counterfactuals. Philosophers are interested in the analysis of counterfactuals. I'm a philosopher of science. I don't do science. I'm interested in examining the robustness of the concepts that scientists use. So when scientists say there's a difference between a law and an accidental generalization, I ended up spending 10 years of my life probing that distinction. It's a distinction that scientists take for granted as obvious, and the philosopher's job is to scratch at it and ask if it's so obvious. So philosophers don't use counterfactuals, they think about counterfactuals. Then your question asks is, how is it different between historians and scientists? Well, that's interesting. Most scientists believe they are positivists. So they say, I only deal with observational evidence. I don't deal with anything that is beyond that. And most scientists, when you press them, will say, I don't believe in the notion that science constrains possibility. But when you look at scientific practice, it's actually shot through with counterfactual claims, claims about laws as constraining possibilities, what philosophers call the modal dimension as opposed to the actual dimension. Laws of physics, when you look at the way they're used, not only tell you what will happen, but they tell you what must happen and what can't happen. It tells you what is possible states of affairs as opposed to impossible states of affairs. So I think that scientists implicitly use counterfactuals every day, but they don't quite realize that they're using it. That's for high-level scientists. When you look at a police detective, he or she is using counterfactuals the whole time. If you've ever played the board game Clue, there are 4 possibilities, and you basically rule them out one by one. And when the detective says, well, if you didn't do it, she did it, that detective is engaging in different kinds of counterfactual reasons. If you hadn't done it, she would have done it. When he says, you're both guilty of murder, because if you hadn't done it, she would have done it because she was ready to do it. They're engaging in it as well. So the question you ask, your questioner asks, what about historians using counterfactuals? This is where it gets interesting, because I think most historians deny they would ever use counterfactuals, which I think, again, going back to Collingwood, is a misunderstanding on their part. But if you look at some historians, and I write about this at the beginning of the paper, some historians believe counterfactuals are plausible, defensible, and important, and they restrict them to the alternatives that were available to historical actors at the time. And I think that's a plausible starting point for how to think about counterfactuals, particularly if you're thinking of great man and history, and you say, well, Churchill was sitting there, and he had a choice between a landing in Normandy or a landing in yada, yada, yada. And he decided on Normandy. Well, if he had decided on the other alternative, then what would have happened? So I do think that there is this idea that some historians have, that I have to restrict myself in counterfactuals to alternatives that are available to the historical players. And I think that is an artificial restriction on the way counterfactuals actually work in history. And I also think that doesn't deal with the real problem of counterfactuals, which is it only deals with the selection of the plausible first part of the counterfactual. It doesn't deal with the second part. If Churchill had chosen to land in Calais rather than Normandy, then, and you make an assertion, how plausible is that part of it? The historians don't normally think about that, and that's what I was trying to raise in this paper. Is the signal better now?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's much better.
Okay, good.
Steven?
Nick.
Or-
Right. Professor, this may
Yeah.
be quite a novitiate question. I think you probably anticipated this as the first question in response to your paper. But in your paper, you argue that for a counterfactual to be academically respectable or robust, not only should the consequent follow from the antecedent, but the antecedent should also be, in a sense, grounded in the laws of nature, causality, and rationality. Do you think that when it comes to especially the laws of rationality, that the word laws in this statement is doing a lot of the weightlifting? By that, I mean, say, if we were discussing the counterfactual of the exact location Churchill decided to deploy his troops, or if we consider the counterfactual of the 9 judges deciding Gore v. Bush, you can speculate that it could have gone either way, but would that amount to, in a sense, ignoring each of their idiosyncratic, peculiar psychological makeups? To say that Churchill may have chosen another location to bomb, another location to deploy troops, or to say that maybe Kennedy would have decided in favor of Gore, is to, in a sense, be neutral to the peculiar psychological and cognitive mechanisms that occur in Kennedy's mind. If one were to really have access to a blow-by-blow account of his thoughts, one may argue that it inevitably led to the decision he made, just as Indira Gandhi would have probably slept had she not been assassinated. Do you think it's important to also consider psychological laws or cognitive laws, if there is such a thing? And if so, how can any counterfactual, besides trivial ones, be academically respectable?
Okay, good. So let's back up and let me restate that I think that laws of physics give you the most robust counterfactual because they constrain possibility independent of us. But let's note that that means you're embracing a very rich notion of laws, not a positivist notion of laws, a notion that laws have modal force. And from then, as you deal with constraints on counterfactuals, it gets sort of weaker and weaker as you go down the ladder. I have said, if you're looking at game theory, if you're looking at the history of war or battle history, and it's a big and if you can assume that the players are rational agents, then you can impose constraints from rational principles. When Saddam Hussein claimed he had nuclear weapons and Bush attacked, I said to my friends, how could any rational agent claim to have nuclear weapons when he doesn't? Because it would seem such a crazy notion to do, because you're inviting such an attack. And I didn't know whether to conclude that Saddam Hussein was irrational or that I had missed something in the sophistication of his reasoning. But I think that the notion of rationality imposes pretty powerful constraints, but only if you can assume the agents are rational. The problem is, and your question shows this, there are many issues where you might want to ask counterfactuals where rationality is not a constraint. It's not a rational choice that's taking place. And by rational choice, I meant things like game theory or obeying the rules of expected utility. And let me remind you, he just died, Daniel Kahneman of Kahneman and Tversky, the couple that developed behavioral economics, showed how much in our economic behavior we deviate from rational laws of economics. So you raise a different question then. What about the decision-making that depends on the psychology of particular agents? And you speak of Kennedy making decisions, Kennedy on the Supreme Court making decisions. And the problem here is that, and I'm not a psychologist, but I'll give my opinion, I don't think we have any strict generalities of psychology that we can rely on. So the problem is, what are the constraints, if any, in that situation? If you look at that particular Supreme Court ruling, I think the much more plausible source of constraints, if there are any constraints, have to do with the political dispositions of the actors involved, the members of the Supreme Court. If you try and pose counterfactuals outside that very constrained political environment and consider what you're talking about, then I think it becomes really dicey. Although I'll give you an example close to home that I've been thinking about. I have a relative who is suffering from frontal lobe dementia. That means the front part of his brain is decaying. And the front part of the brain constrains social inhibition. So at the risk of offending you, it's dangerous to take him to a restaurant because he gropes for the breasts of the waitresses, even though he's a homosexual. And now, this is something where we actually have a pretty reliable psychological generalizations because it's neurologically based. We know the center of the brain that deals with social inhibition and particular things like sexuality. And so we can have a pretty reliable generalization about what happens if that part of the brain stops, is destroyed. So I can see some kind of constraints of psychoneurology arising that might ground these counterfactuals.
But I think the kinds of cases you're raising are much more problematic. I think if I was going to look for them, I would look in social psychology, not in individual psychology, because I said in my opening remarks, I think that we are much more constrained by social psychology than individual psychology. We live under the illusion that many of our choices are free choices, when in fact they are the result of conformity to the culture we raise in. And that's a much richer source of constraint, I think, in human psychology than I think we find in individual psychology. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure it did.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, related to the case you just related about your relative, I had read about a case of an individual who had to undergo a partial lobotomy due to frequent epileptic seizures. And he gets the surgery done. He gets a tiny part of his brain removed. And his wife, who lived with him, notices that his behavior has subtly shifted. He's developed a voracious appetite for food, for sex. He used to be quite the musician, but now he doesn't go next to his piano. And little does she know, 6 months down the line, the FBI knocks at their door and arrests him for consumption of child pornography. It turns out, in that case, that the part of the brain that was removed in his case was responsible for, in a sense, putting a cork on people's appetites. But the startling conclusion that it also led to, because it's not like he had urges to consume child pornography prior to the surgery. The startling conclusion was that, like, the not putting a curb on your appetites is almost like a capillary action towards having more and more outlandish and voracious appetites. That, like, not putting a ceiling on it just leads to newer and newer appetites that wouldn't have arisen before. Yeah.
Well, maybe, or, you know, maybe men in particular only behave decently because of constraints posed on them. I mean, I don't need to remind you that, you know, once you lose the external inhibition of social constraints, particularly in war, rape and pillage takes place. So yours is a special case. And just by the by and aside, I'm familiar with these cases. We've had them in New York, and it poses a very interesting moral and legal question. Do you hold people legally responsible, put them in jail in this kind of situation? But to go back to our subject, I mean, this is not really psychology. This is neurology. And, you know, here you have a wonderful counterfactual. If he hadn't had the lobotomy, he wouldn't be in trouble with the child pornography business. I mean, he had other troubles. And that's a pretty reliable one if you believe, and I actually wrote a book on this with a psychologist, if you believe there is point-specific functional localization in the brain of different kinds of functions, something that actually now is somewhat up for grabs. But if you can believe that, if you have good evidence for that, then you have very robust counterfactuals, but they're not really psychologically based, they're neurologically based.
I know it's veering us off track, but could you talk a little bit more about, like, why it's up for grab, that there may be point specific areas of the brain that are responsible for particular?
Well, there are two major reasons to think about it. First of all, we have much greater evidence of the plasticity of the brain, and a lot of it comes from studying people who have damage to their brain, going all the way back to the great Russian neurologist Luria, who studied Russian brain damaged soldiers at the beginning of the 20th century, was able to discuss deficits in their psychological function as opposed to neurological damage. But since then, we've had great discoveries about the way in which different parts of the brain can repurpose themselves to pick up functions that have been lost from other parts of the brain. So that notion of plasticity teaches us a lot, that function is not as fixed as we thought. But the other thing is that there are two competing theories of neurological functioning, one of which has to do with isolated point-specific functions in the brain. The other is a a much more holistic theory that argues that the whole brain state is involved in a lot of function. It has to do with interactions between them. And from a philosophy of science point of view, what's really interesting about this is that the early stages of mapping brain function, where you stick the person in a MRI machine and you have them do certain things, and you take scans of you take pictures of their brain, the limitation of the degree of specificity and definition of the machine very much drove the results you could get. And that tended to, in a sense, inadvertently underscore the idea of localism, because you couldn't get pictures of the whole brain functioning. And now, as the power of these machines increase, we're able to get much richer picture of it.
Hi, Professor Bansal. So it's related to Deven's question and your answer to it, which is that in certain instances, it is probably best counterfactuals. It is probably best practice to assume that the actors involved are rational actors, because other alternatives lead you in an infinite number of possibilities. But there may be some instances where it would be historiographically irresponsible to consider actors rational actors, such as in the case of mad kings, or in the case of like people who are behaviorally unpredictable. So in that case, those cases, does having a profusion of counterfactuals become more viable and more historiographically valid?
Yeah, it's a great question. The philosophical problem you face, or the psychological question you face, is, let's suppose that you are confronted with a person that you conclude is manifestly irrational. It doesn't have to be a king, person on the bus. Then what basis, if any, do you have to predict their behavior? Rationality gives you constraint in your predictions of behavior, and treating people as if they are rational. I mean, we're not by any means perfectly rational, even under ideal circumstances. So in economics, we treat agents as if they're rational in order to get a purchase of mathematical tractability and generalizability on it. And it works in a kind of rough and ready way without being perfect. If you haven't read the literature on behavioral economics originated by Kahneman and Tversky, I urge you to read it, because it's eye-opening to see the way in which we deviate from even minimal rationality and distort choices we make in the economic marketplace. If you suspend rationality as a guiding fiction in understanding people's behavior, predictively and explanatorily, let alone counterfactually, the challenge you face is, what's the alternative? Now, if you are a psychiatrist and you study a lot of people, let's say, who have paranoid schizophrenia, you may have some reliable generalizations as to the likely way in which their disturbed thinking operates. And that might work to your advantage. Just like we were talking about frontal lobe dementia. The issue you posed of child pornography in frontal lobe dementia is a pretty reliable finding, unfortunately. So if the failure of rationality falls into a kind of stable explanatory category, you could in fact generate counterfactuals based on our knowledge of the way in which that deviation takes place. The problem, however, you pose is sort of a Mad King George situation, is it's as it were a one-off madman, and he doesn't fall into any stable category. And then the thought experiment you might want to engage in to try and investigate how you would deal with it is, what basis do you have for making predictions? I mean, it's weird. I did a sort of experiment prompted by my grandchildren. I adopted a homeless woman here where I live on the street who is clearly paranoid schizophrenic. And I thought I could help her, and trying to act in a sort of quasi-rational way with her, and even trying to get into her head relative to her kind of pathological thinking, just proved to be impossible. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Again, to summarize, I think that if you assume someone is not rational, unless you have some alternative account to understand and predict their behavior, it has to be, in a sense, predictively non-rational, but still operate according to some constraints. Then I don't see how you can produce any counterfactuals that have reliability. If on the other hand, it is constrained in some kind of non-standard way, then maybe you can. It's an interesting question, actually. I hadn't thought about that.
And also to impose those constraints on events of the past or psychologies of the past, psychological makeups, neurological makeups of the past, you would have to effectively diagnose the actors, which is in itself a dicey proposition.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, I don't know. Suppose you find a historical actor and, I don't know, you find their mummified brains, and their brains are still okay, so you can dissect the brains and you say, he has frontal lobe dementia. I can see what he said. Or even Mad King George. There is a notion. What does Mad King George have? Is he paranoid schizophrenic? I don't remember. He's somewhat reliably crazy. He's not just crazy.
It's crazy enough to have to shut up, in a cut away.
But again, take my Saddam Hussein example. Was he deviating from rationality when he said he had the bomb and it was all made up?
But then can we make a larger point to say that men in power are always sort of susceptible to certain deviations from rationality, and then that becomes a social behavioral kind of thing again?
Well, you think so?
Men in power.
Take the current men in power in India and in the United States. We're on an open line, so we'll restrain ourselves in what we say about them. But let's just say I can say about Trump, let's say, he's a narcissist and a pathological liar, but you can be a narcissist and you can still be a rational narcissist and pathological liar, and he's a megalomaniac. But are you saying you can't be a rational megalomaniac?
But
your guy is a pretty rational megalomaniac. He's pretty consistently.
Something pathological going on in the stuff that he says, or whatever. So I'm saying that aren't these things constraints on rationality? Megalomania, narcissism, are these not? Don't these automatically? And then if you think about dynastic monarchy, a person who is brought up in that situation where he knows that he's God's anointed, etc., which these people also seem to think that they are God's anointed. Actually, we have not really cancelled that out. So wouldn't that impact the way in which? Yeah.
The counters to say the incidence of non-rational behavior is as high among the rich and powerful as among everyone else. By the way, I wanted to say I saw your video of you standing up to the crowd. You're pretty gutsy.
Well, I didn't know. Yeah. Thank you. I regretted that later, but anyway.
I don't know. Again, though, I go back to the question your colleague just asked. Even if you take your view, you're still faced with the question of how you explain their behavior. If you give up the assumption of rationality, this is a view of a philosopher, Donald Davidson, which is if you give up the assumption of rationality, what, if anything, guides how you explain the behavior of the other? That you can only get going the explanation of the other by assuming rationality. Now, I think that's wrong for the reasons we just discussed. If you have a reliable account of the nature of the deviation from rationality, then you can rely on that. And there are certain kinds of, as we were saying earlier, neurological conditions that produce deviation, or maybe there's certain drugs that you can take that produce a predictable form of deviation from rationality. But for the regular guy who's in power and goes, as it were, drunk on power, I don't think it's a narrow enough band to get something going.
Right.
I don't know. Do you think you can? I mean,
I'm thinking out loud. I'm
yeah.
not.
I mean,
Yeah, I'm
it's
not-
like, I mean, I don't know.
If I may, Professor, I mean,
Yes.
I suppose you can think of rationality here in two different ways. One is whether a person's actions align with their, let's call it like micro interests, their immediate interest in getting something done. And the second is whether their micro interests align with their larger interests. In the sense that if Saddam, let's say, says something like he has nuclear weapons, in retrospect, we think that his in retrospect, we believe that, of course, that damaged his larger interest of not having Iraq invaded. But he perhaps was mistaken in thinking that him admitting to him lying about having nuclear weapons would have led to a different consequence. So I'm sorry for bungling
Say
it
the
up.
last sentence. Say the last sentence.
Yeah,
didn't
sorry.
think-
What I mean to say is that even when people sympathetic to Trump sort of analyze his decisions, his erratic decision making, they assume that, of course, it seems to us that his micro interests don't align with his larger interests of securing the American economy. But what he's really doing is playing 4D chess of some kind with international politics, with domestic politics, etc. So when we're talking about whether an actor is rational or not, do we mean that their actions don't align with their immediate interests, or do we mean that their immediate interests don't align with what ought to be their larger interests?
Well, you just put ought to be, which complicates the situation. So let's take out the ought to be. You raise an interesting question. Let's treat rational choice as maximizing your expected utility. That is, you look at a choice between A and B, and you choose that action which will produce the best outcome for you based on the probability of realizing one outcome rather than another. Now, you say, well, maybe he was acting on short-term interests rather than long-term interests. That's a good point, because I think most politicians act in terms of short-term self-interest, not long-term interests. You go from one crisis to the next crisis. My wife, who just walked by, teaches a course on German history, and one of the central claims is there is no grand plan for Hitler. It's one short-term emergency political action after another. It's dealing with this interest group and that interest group, and decisions are just made one after another on a short-term basis, and boom, suddenly you're in the war, and suddenly you're doing this, and suddenly you're doing that. Same, I bet, for your current political leader. I mean, it's a mistake to think, I think there's some grand scheme. It's just, one thing after another. So I think rational action is for most of us, rational action is based on the short-term horizon of possibility. And you're right, at the risk of cultural caricature, I think that, I deal a lot on Middle East politics as a sideline. And I think one of the problems of the many between Israel and the Palestinians of the Arab world is you have a completely different culture of political performance. And one of the things in Arab culture is there's a much greater emphasis on public gesture and rhetorical gesture. And I think Saddam's statement about the nuclear bomb was much more in the tradition of this grand rhetorical gesture that plays an important political role in terms of how you're seen on the street. So I think actually it can be, I think it can actually be explained, his actions can be explained rationally, particularly if you incorporate a certain provinciality in his thinking, that he was thinking of his particular country and his particular neighbors, not the grand geopolitical situation. And
in the sense that whenever you
same with
think-
Trump, by the way. You can only explain Trump on very narrow parochial interests of an ignorant man. You can't, you're already down the wrong rabbit hole if you're trying to explain, oh, he's some brilliant geopolitical strategist strategizing about the world. Yeah.
In the sense that whenever you deem a person to be irrational or to be acting irrationally, what may be the case is that your conception of their short-term interest is wrong. That they may be acting rationally to their own
Yes.
short-term interests, and you're
Yes.
assuming them to have a different one.
Yes.
How
But-
do you know that in your analysis, how do you determine their short-term interest before looking at their behavior?
Before looking at what?
Before observing their behavior, how do you determine their short-term interest?
Well, short-term interests are in the eye of the beholder. You know, I can't, it's not an objective matter. It's how does he see his short-term interests? But, you know, when you try and explain Pol Pot and the 6 million or however million people died in Cambodia, and you try and put the standard journalistic thing is he's crazy. If we say that's naive, and then we try and apply your suggestion, which I agree with, now I guess the exercise is, can we come up with some short-term interests that would explain his political choices? You can try and do a sort of backward engineered analysis of it and see if there's a set that would come up with it. Same with Stalin. If you want to explain how things end up the way they do, is it a series of short-term choices which are rational, or is it the way in which the journalists would want to say he was clearly crazy to be doing it? I'm with the former rather than the latter. But it's a difficult exercise because you don't have access, unless you could sit down and tell me what you were thinking, as it were, with how they're actually thinking, and they're not going to tell you the truth. Yeah.
Right. Some people have raised their hands. Gilbert, do you have a
Yes.
question? Will you unmute yourself and just ask the question?
Yeah. Okay, here we go. At one point, you raised doubt about the idea that imagination can be a source of evidence. But I assume you're familiar with, there's a lot of work on this recently arguing that it can be. And I was just wondering what you think. I mean, what I'm familiar with is they use examples like imagining spatial configurations. So like if you're imagining moving an object in a doorway past a corner and that sort of thing. So you use your imagination to see whether it will work. And it does seem to be some sort of evidence that whether it will or will not work. And
Whether what will or will not work.
whether moving it in a certain way, whether
I
the
see.
object will fit.
Right.
And you can see, of course, that construction workers do that kind of thing all the time.
Right.
I would assume. And then there's a whole nother area of research relating to practical concerns. So you imagine you're making a choice, and you imagine the various options, you imagine how you would feel, or what would things be like if you chose that option. And so it's imagining how you would feel does seem to be evidence, in favor of choosing some option over another.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm not familiar with the research, but I get the gist of it. So let me take the second part first. I think that's a great point, and I should amend what I said at the beginning of our meeting here on imagination. But let's note that's got a very narrow domain of interests. You are discovering how you would feel under certain settings. So the object of your examination is your own feelings, or how you would feel about that. And what it assumes is a reliability of your preferences and access to your preferences over time. And I think that's all pretty reasonable, although in a book I'm writing right now, I'm interested in the difficulty of making these choices where you are radically changing your life. So it's based on a book by a very imaginative book
by a American philosopher whose name I forget, Laurie Paul, which she says, you imagine you have a choice to become a vampire. Well, you look at the practical choices. Should I become a vampire or not? And the point is, you can't reliably rely on your imagination as a non-vampire and imagine what it would be like to be a vampire. Or imagine, you know, you're going to be one of those Indians who's, you know, sits in a cave and gets very long nails and does all that stuff. Should I do that? It's too different. But I concede the point on imagination for yourself on the assumption that your preferences are stable and you have access to them. So I think that's a good point. With regard to the first point, the issue is, are your imaginations constrained by laws of physics? At the first blush, I think not. So I don't see how your imagination would be reliable. I'll give a counter argument in support of you in a minute. I don't see at first blush how your imagination could be a reliable source of evidence for the way in which the physics of the world work. At least when things matter a lot, you know. Now here's a counter to that. I like to shock my relatives and my students. So I had them I said to one of my, actually a relative, I said, don't you think it's kind of amazing that evolution has worked out that we want to have sex with human beings and not with stones? And then I said, actually, it's not very surprising, because if you were attracted to stones and tried to have sex with them, you wouldn't actually expand the gene pool with those kinds of preferences. So we have, in fact, by natural selection, developed capacities for imagination that happily conform with the world. Because if we didn't, the idea would be we'd be dead pretty soon. But that argument works well for perception. You know, perception is an incredibly complicated reconstruction of the real world in our brains in a kind of projection that happily coincides with the way the world is. Yeah. I'm not seeing the world. The world, what I'm experiencing is a reconstruction in my brain. Happily coincides pretty well with the world. Otherwise, I'd be dead and I wouldn't have any children.
Yeah. I mean,
well, let me just finish. So the question is, in a sense, you're assuming, or this research is assuming, imagination operates on the similar set of constraints. And I'm kind of dubious about that as reliable, because I think the whole virtue of the whole function of imagination is that it operates in ways that are much less constrained than our awake, sentient, normal interactions. Just witness the way things work in dreams. I have to think about it. I mean, I think you have a point, but I don't think it can go too far, because I don't think there's evidence that imagination is constrained reliably to conform to the physical constraints on the world, even though it may have developed to some extent on evolutionary grounds.
Well, there's also, you know, the idea of folk physics, that so these construction workers would be using folk physics. Also, it occurred to me that maybe you're construing imagination too narrowly or strictly, because the kind of thing I was talking about, you know, deciding what to do, one is doing that all the time. I'm just moving through life. Similarly, I think, you know, this spatial imagination you're also doing pretty much all the time, and it does seem to be a function of imagination to me.
Well, let me just say, with regard to the construction workers, I don't think it's imagination. I think it's practical knowledge. If you keep sawing wood, if you're a carpenter and you saw wood, you just develop a kind of, through experience, a kind of folk wisdom from doing it again and again. With regard to the second issue, I mean, maybe you're right. You're right that I'm trying to think of it. I didn't mean to be doing it narrowly. I wanted to say the question is, how reliable is it? You're right that a lot of our cognitive function goes on outside consciousness, and we rely probably on scripts and routines that involve imagination to go through things that we are going to do in the real world. And they have a degree of reliability simply through experience. I guess the question I would pose to you, however, is why is this important from the point of view of counterfactual reasoning? Can you give me, I mean, I want examples where, even if I conceded your point, I want examples where imagination could give me evidence that wasn't available under other circumstances. And I'm not clear where they come up, and I'm not clear how much weight to put on them. But I'll think about what you said. Yeah.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think like in the deciding what to do case, it's really it seemed to be a matter of a change in temporal perspective. So when you're deciding what to do, you're imagining the different options and imagining how they would be, how you would feel, and so on.
But look, let me interrupt you. I don't think that's quite fair, because I conceded that, but I said that's very different from what you started off with.
Yeah.
Absolutely right with regard to preferences.
Yeah, but you can look back on it and say, if I had done X, then I would have, that's it. So at least
look again, I concede that. I had a bagel this morning with an egg on it. And I can look back and say, if I'd had a cinnamon raisin bagel, I would have been happier. Because I have a cinnamon raisin bagel or an egg with a bagel every morning. It's one or the other. Yeah. So yeah, I don't dispute that, but that rides on stability. I'm a very conservative guy in my preferences. Indian restaurant, same 2 or 3 meals. Chinese restaurant, every 2 or 3. I'm a vegetarian. That's all you can eat around here. It's like, Halamoto gobi or chana masala. Those are the 2 dishes you can eat.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Shomnath had a question. I think he had raised his hand at some point. I don't know whether he's still. Shomnath?
Oh, no, it was an observation about male political leaders, because Angela Merkel made a somewhat similar point in Athens today, where she compared 2 global world leaders to grown-up man-children who just want attention. Given that she successfully managed one of them for a few years, I think she has experience in this regard.
Well, the question is, if the grown-up man-children are not, why not put it that way? The question is, even children can be rational agents. It's just their preference. Their preferences are very different. So again, what she was grappling with was narcissistic megalomania.
Oh yes, she said that they were attention seeking.
In fact, that's what she said, I think. But I don't think she ever claimed they were not rational. So that's the issue.
Right. Any other questions? I think we are nearly at our 90 minutes kind of limit. No? Okay. So thank you very much, Professor Bandal. This has been great. Very, very nice discussion. And I will send you that article on first.
Yes, please do. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all for your interest. And if anyone wants to follow up, you can go to my website in my name and you'll see my email, and feel free to be in touch. Okay. Thank you all.
Yeah, we have before you hello.
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry, before you go, we have Jack Levy on next week.
Yeah, we have Jack Levy next week.
Who's a political scientist. Yeah, Doida will go ahead. Yeah.
He's also from Rutgers, and I think he cited your work also in his essay on counterfactuals, and he also was, expressing interest about today's discussion, etc. So anyway, that's happening. If you're
good. All right.
In case you'd like to, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.